Introduction: Security in a resource-poor nation. Currently, the closure of the Strait of Hormuz has caused serious disruption to global resource supply. Japan is often described as a resource-poor nation among developed countries. In fact, many of the resources that support Japan's industry, such as oil, natural gas, and iron ore, depend heavily on imports. For example, when we look at energy resources, Japan imports about 99% of its oil, about 97% of its natural gas, about 99% of its coal. This means Japan has an extremely high dependence on imports. However, Japan is also a country that has built one of the most systematic national resource stockpiling systems in the world. Japan stores large quantities of oil and critical minerals at the national level. So, why did Japan build such a large-scale stockpiling system? Background: the oil shock. Japan's resource stockpiling policy began with the oil shocks of the 1970s. During the first oil shock in 1973, OPEC restricted oil exports following the Middle East War, triggering a global energy crisis. At that time, Japan depended on imports for about 99.8% of its oil supply. As a result, Japan experienced severe economic disruption, including gasoline shortages, logistical breakdowns, rapid inflation. This experience led the Japanese government to recognize that disruptions in energy supply were not just an economic issue, but a matter of national security. In 1975, Japan began to seriously develop its national petroleum stockpiling system. Japan's petroleum stockpiling system. Today, the core of Japan's stockpiling system is oil reserves. Japan maintains three main types of oil stockpiles. Government stockpiles. These are oil reserves managed by the government and stored in facilities such as underground rock caverns. The total amount is about 50 million kiloliters, equivalent to roughly 146 days of domestic consumption. Private stockpiles. Oil companies are legally required to maintain 70 days of reserves. In practice, companies maintain even more. Current private reserves amount to about 30 million kiloliters, equivalent to roughly 101 days of consumption. Joint stockpiles. Japan also operates joint stockpiling programs with oil-producing countries such as Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Under this system, crude oil from these countries is stored in Japan. These joint reserves correspond to roughly 7 days of supply, about 1.96 million kiloliters. In total, Japan possesses stockpiles equivalent to roughly 254 days of oil supply. For comparison, the International Energy Agency, IEA, requires its member countries to maintain oil reserves equal to at least 90 days of imports. Japan far exceeds this requirement. Rare metals and rare earths. Japan's stockpiling system is not limited to oil. Critical rare metals used in high-tech industries are also stockpiled at the national level. These include cobalt, nickel, chromium, manganese, tungsten. These materials are essential for industries such as aircraft manufacturing, batteries, semiconductors, defense technologies. Japan maintains national reserves of these materials equivalent to roughly 60 days of supply. Another crucial issue is rare earth elements. In 2010, during diplomatic tensions between Japan and China, China effectively halted exports of rare earths to Japan. At the time, China accounted for about 97% of global rare earth production. Japan's industrial sector suddenly faced a severe supply risk. However, this crisis triggered a major strategic response by Japan. The government and industry rapidly promoted strengthening rare earth stockpiles, diversification of supply sources, investment in new supply chains, development of recycling technologies, research into alternative materials. As a result, Japan's dependence on China dropped from about 90% to roughly 60%. Today, Japan has built a structure in which its industrial production would not immediately stop even if exports were halted again. Based on lessons from the past, Japan has secured roughly 60 days' worth of rare earth stockpiles and plans to further expand these reserves. The strategy enabled by stockpiles. Resource stockpiles are not simply emergency supplies. They increase a nation's strategic resilience. In the event of a major supply disruption, Japan can maintain resource supplies for several months using its reserves. Many other countries do not possess reserves of this scale. As a result, other economies may reach their limits sooner and be forced to resume trade flows despite the risks. Japan can then re-enter the supply chain once those flows resume. Stockpiles also play an important role when resources are restricted as a form of political pressure. By relying on its reserves, Japan can secure time to build alternative supply chains. Meanwhile, the country attempting to restrict exports continues to lose sales opportunities, suffering economic losses. In this sense, stockpiles provide several strategic advantages: mitigating economic shocks, increasing resilience against political pressure, securing time to rebuild supply chains. Conclusion: strategy of a resource-poor nation. Japan is not a country rich in natural resources. However, it has responded to resource risks by combining large-scale stockpiling systems, technological development, diversification of supply chains. In other words, Japan's resource policy can be seen as a survival strategy for a resource-poor nation, and the national stockpiling system is one of its most symbolic mechanisms.
Thanks for watching. Subscribe to Deep Focus Japan for more videos on Japanese society and current issues.